Call a cab. I'm watching the game. That was the message my son sent me the night after my heart surgery. His words, cold and careless, pierced deeper than the stitches across my chest. As if that wound wasn't enough, his wife Sarah followed with her own remark. "Stay another month. It feels so nice without you here." I stared at the glowing screen in disbelief. I had faced storms at sea, sleepless nights in warehouses, and the aching silence of losing my wife, but nothing prepared me for betrayal by my own blood. Lying in that hospital bed, the sterile white walls closing in on me, I realized I had never felt more alone. My heart, mended by surgeons, broke in a way no scalpel could ever fix. I didn't reply. I didn't beg for mercy or plead for love. I simply put the phone down and let the quiet fill the room. But that night, as they sat comfortably in their home, flipping through channels and laughing at jokes that excluded me, they had no idea what was coming. By the time the evening news aired the next day, my face would appear on the screen. And when it did, their carefully built world would begin to crumble piece by piece. My name is Thomas Miller, and when people look at me now, they see only an older man with silver hair and lines etched deep into his face. But behind those lines are the years of service, sacrifice, and choices that shaped me. I am 68 years old, once a sailor in the United States Navy, later a warehouse manager who kept shipments moving and schedules tight. My back has bent under years of lifting boxes and responsibilities, yet I have always carried myself with quiet discipline. The Navy taught me that endurance is not optional, that you do not cry out when the sea is rough, you simply hold the wheel and ride the storm until the waters calm. That philosophy guided my entire life, through marriage, fatherhood, and widowhood. I built my existence not on speeches, but on action. I was the man who showed up, the father who fixed what was broken, the husband who kept food on the table even when the bills felt heavier than the paycheck. I believed that consistency spoke louder than words. Michael, my son, once clung to my shoulders as a boy at county fairs, laughing as the carousel spun and the music rang through the summer air. I remember his hair sticking up with sweat as he shouted that I was the strongest man alive. Those memories kept me alive during long nights when I worked overtime, hauling crates and tallying inventory under buzzing fluorescent lights. I thought that boy's admiration would one day transform into respect. I thought he would look at me as a man to follow. But time has a cruel way of reshaping people, and somewhere along the line, my little boy grew into a man who sees me less as a father and more as an inconvenience. When Michael met Sarah, I told myself to be grateful. She was polite enough in public, quick with a practiced smile, and she seemed to keep him happy. Yet from the first dinner at my table, I sensed something behind her eyes. It was subtle, a flicker of impatience, the way her sentences curved with dismissal whenever I spoke. I tried to ignore it, believing that acceptance would come with time, that once she saw I was not a threat, she would allow me a corner in their hearts. Instead, she made me feel like a guest, in places where I had once been the host. She was clever, never openly cruel, but her remarks always landed just sharp enough to remind me that I did not belong. Margaret, my wife, was the glue that held our family together. She softened Michael's stubborn edges and gave Sarah no room for arrogance. She had a gentle way of balancing the house, making every gathering feel like a holiday. When she passed away 5 years ago, the air seemed to leave the rooms, and so did the sense of home. After her funeral, Michael and Sarah stayed for 3 days, and on the third evening, Sarah sat me down with a smile that never reached her eyes and said, "Dad, you should think about moving somewhere smaller. This house is too much for you now." I understood the words, but what I heard was, "This place no longer belongs to you." I sold the home Margaret and I had built with 40 years of effort. Every nail, every garden bed, every coat of paint had been ours, and I handed it over to strangers while telling myself that walls and floors do not hold love, that memories live inside us, not in wood and plaster. But when I locked the door for the last time, it felt like I had surrendered more than a building. I had surrendered the center of our family. The apartment I moved into was modest. It had thin walls and neighbors who barely nodded, but I told myself I did not need more. Michael and Sarah had their own space, and I wanted them to fill it with joy and grandchildren. I hoped I could be the quiet supporter in the background, a man who stepped in when asked and faded politely when not needed. That was the role I accepted, though it tasted of loneliness. Through the years, Michael and Sarah often reached out when they wanted something. Money was the most common request. Sometimes it was for car repairs, sometimes for down payments, once for a loan to cover what they called a temporary setback. They promised repayment, swore with conviction, but repayment never came. I remained silent, convincing myself it was better not to keep score, that generosity was its own reward. But silence became a heavy habit, one that swallowed my dignity little by little. Holidays revealed the truth more clearly than any ledger could. Thanksgiving dinners felt cold, even with hot dishes on the table. The family gathered, yet the warmth was missing. Michael stared at his phone. Sarah whispered about diets and heart conditions as if I were a burden, and I scraped my plate alone at the end of the table. Once, when I asked for leftovers, Sarah smiled tightly and said, "We were not sure what you could eat with your heart problems." She handed nothing. That moment carved into me deeper than any doctor's scalpel. And then there was Emily, my daughter, my saving grace. She lived in Denver, too far to visit often, working endless shifts as a nurse. Her life was filled with exhaustion, yet she never forgot me. A call every Sunday, a letter every few months, a card with simple words that could light my entire week. On my birthday, she mailed me an old photograph of us at the zoo, her little arms around my neck, her handwriting on the back. "Dad, you will always be my lion." That one line carried more weight than all the empty promises Michael ever gave me. As time wore on, the distance between Michael and me grew into something nearly unbridgeable. His calls were rare, and when they came, they revolved around needs, signatures, favors, co-signing documents. I told myself each yes might remind him of the bond we once had, but the truth was harsher. Bridges cannot be built by one man alone. When the heart surgery came, I should not have been surprised at their reaction, yet some part of me still hoped. I thought facing the fragility of life might awaken his compassion, might remind him of the boy who once shouted, "Daddy's home," with joy. But instead of a visit, or even a warm word, I received those messages: "Call a cab, I'm watching the game," and Sarah's echo, "Stay another month. It feels so nice without you here." Those words did not just hurt. They declared me unnecessary. They told me plainly that I had been erased. That night, lying under the cold light of the hospital room, I thought about silence. All my life, I had chosen it. Silence in the Navy, silence at work, silence in my marriage, when peace was more important than pride. But silence had transformed from strength into surrender, and I knew in that moment I could not keep surrendering. Something inside me shifted, subtle but powerful, like the first breeze before a storm. For the first time in decades, I felt the stirrings of defiance. The evening after my surgery was quiet, except for the hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of nurses. I should have felt grateful to be alive, but instead I was weighed down by the realization that my own family saw me as an inconvenience. With one text message and a single careless remark, Michael and Sarah had managed to crush whatever remained of my fragile hope. My chest ached not only from the stitches, but from the hollowness inside me. When the nurse came in to check my vitals, she asked if someone would be picking me up the next day. I smiled faintly and said, "Yes, I will manage," even though I knew the truth was different. That night I opened the family group chat and typed carefully, "Who can pick me up tomorrow?" The words were simple, but behind them was a plea I could never voice directly. I imagined my son reading them and realizing that after everything I had done for him, this was his chance to step forward and show me I still mattered. What I got in return was a digital blow. Michael wrote back, "Call a cab, I'm watching the game." I stared at those words, blinking, unable to believe them. Then Sarah chimed in with her cold addition, "Stay another month. It feels so nice without you here." I read the messages again and again until the screen blurred. My hand trembled, but not from weakness. It was anger mixed with grief, emotions colliding like storm waves inside me. For decades I had held my tongue, letting slights pass, convincing myself that patience was noble. Yet lying in that bed, I understood something clearly. This was not patience. It was erasure. They were not just ignoring me, they were pushing me out of their lives bit by bit, as if I were an old photograph fading in a frame. When morning came, I did not wait for them. I dialed a cab company and arranged my own ride. The driver, a man about my age with tired eyes and country music humming softly from the radio, lifted my small bag into the trunk and said nothing more than, "You doing all right, sir?" I nodded, but inside I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that my son had abandoned me after open heart surgery, that my daughter-in-law celebrated my absence. Instead, I sat in silence, watching the city blur past the window as the car carried me back to my small apartment. The building greeted me with its familiar creaks and smells of reheated food. I eased myself into the chair by the window, the one spot where the afternoon light softened the gloom. I should have rested, but my mind would not stop replaying the words. "Call a cab. It feels so nice without you." They echoed until they became a rhythm of rejection, a cruel song I could not silence. I thought about Margaret, how she would have held my hand and whispered strength into me. I thought about Emily, who would have taken a bus across states if she could afford it, just to be by my side. And then I thought about Michael, the little boy who once begged me to throw a football until the sun dipped behind the trees. Where had that boy gone? Was he buried beneath years of ambition, or had he simply vanished, leaving behind a man who saw his father as dead weight? The truth sank into me like a stone. For the first time in my life, I felt exiled from my own family. Not by distance, not by circumstance, but by choice. Their choice, and that hurt more than any illness. I turned on the television that evening, trying to distract myself. The news anchor's voice filled the room with reports of city projects, crime statistics, weather patterns. My attention drifted until suddenly I saw a familiar face. It was Frank Delaney, an old friend from my Navy days. He stood proudly in front of a camera, speaking about a local charity for veterans. He looked older, yes, with lines around his eyes and hair as grey as mine, but his spirit was unbroken. He spoke about rebuilding parks, creating spaces for children, giving back to the community that had once sent us to sea. Watching him stirred something inside me that had long been buried. Frank looked alive, purposeful, respected. He had chosen to remain visible, while I had allowed myself to become invisible. And in that moment I realized that if I continued on the path I was on, I would fade completely. The cruel messages from Michael and Sarah were no longer just insults. They were a revelation. They showed me exactly how little space I occupied in their world. And that clarity, painful as it was, planted a seed of determination. I would not spend the rest of my years waiting for scraps of attention or sitting by a silent phone. My life was not finished, and my story was not theirs to erase. Yet, as I sat in that chair, another thought pierced me. What had led us here? Was it my silence through the years? Had I mistaken endurance for love? Perhaps, by never demanding respect, I had taught them I did not need it. Perhaps by always giving and never asking, I had written my role as the background character in their lives. These thoughts swirled heavy, but instead of drowning me, they pushed me to see the truth. I had surrendered for too long, and surrender had only brought loss. That night, sleep came slowly. I drifted in and out, haunted by memories of better days, by the sound of Margaret's laughter, by Emily's little hand in mine, by Michael's childhood voice echoing through time. I woke before dawn, and as the first light touched the window, I whispered to myself, "No more silence." The cruel messages had not ended my story. They had ignited it. The days after my return from the hospital stretched long and heavy. The apartment felt smaller than ever, its walls closing in on me as if they were tired of holding my loneliness. Each morning I woke to the sound of the pipes rattling, the weak sunlight filtering through thin curtains, and the ache in my chest that no medicine could touch. I tried to tell myself I was lucky to be alive, that surviving open-heart surgery was a victory in itself. but victory tasted bitter when there was no one waiting to share it. I kept checking my phone, though I told myself not to. A part of me hoped that Michael might call, even with just a few words of concern. The phone stayed silent except for Emily's brief messages, squeezed between her shifts. She asked about my recovery, apologized for not being able to come, and ended each note with love. Her words were small, yet they warmed me more than anything else in those days. As I sat in that empty apartment, I could not help but revisit the past, and each memory felt like a knife twisted slowly. After Margaret's death, the house that had been our sanctuary became a battlefield of subtle dismissals. Michael and Sarah stayed only 3 days, and instead of comforting me, they suggested I move out for my own good. The words sounded practical on the surface, but underneath was a message I could not ignore. They wanted space, they wanted distance, they wanted my presence to fade. I swallowed the pain and told myself they knew best, that they were only thinking of me. But when I sold the house, it felt as though I had signed away, not just property but history, a lifetime reduced to papers and signatures. From that moment, cracks began to widen. Michael and Sarah came around mostly when they needed money. They borrowed for bills, for cars, for emergencies that somehow never ended. They promised to repay, but promises from their mouths had become like smoke, vanishing before I could even hold them. I told myself over and over that family does not keep ledgers, but each broken promise left a mark. I had traded pride for the illusion of connection, and in doing so, I had taught them to see me as a resource, not a father. The holidays were the hardest reminders. I still remember one Thanksgiving when I arrived with a homemade pie, eager for a meal that felt like family. Instead, I found silence broken only by the sound of scrolling phones. Michael hardly looked up. Sarah served plates without including me in conversation, and when the meal was over, she denied me even a small portion to take home. She smiled as if it were kindness and said, "We were not sure what you can eat now with your condition." Her words dripped with false concern, but the truth was clear. I was no longer part of their circle, not truly. And yet, through all of this, Emily remained a thread of hope. She lived far away, drowning in work, yet she still reached out. Once she sent me a card with a simple drawing of a lion, reminding me that I had once been strong in her eyes. That small gesture mattered more than any grand act, for it reminded me that I still had value, at least to one child. Now, after the hospital, the contrast between my 2 children felt sharper than ever. Michael's silence was deafening, Sarah's words still stung, but Emily's faint light kept me from sinking completely. Still, the weight of rejection pressed harder each day, and the apartment seemed colder, emptier, as if even the air had grown tired of me. One evening, as I sat watching the flickering television, I thought about the years I had remained silent. Silence had been my shield in the Navy, my method of survival at work, my way of keeping peace in the family. But silence had turned against me. It had become the very tool of my erasure. By not demanding respect, I had taught them that I did not need it. By always giving and never asking, I had shown them that my place was at the edges of their lives. That realization struck me harder than any wound. Still, the cruel truth remained. Silence was no longer survival, it was surrender, and I could not surrender anymore. Something inside me began to stir, faint at first, like a ripple across still water, but it grew stronger with every passing day. I could not let my story end in that empty apartment. I needed to step back into the world, not as a burden, but as a man with purpose. That resolve took root the moment I saw Frank on television. His voice carried conviction. His stance radiated pride, and though he bore the marks of age like I did, he had not let those marks define him. He spoke about rebuilding parks, helping veterans, creating spaces for children. Watching him, I felt a flicker of recognition, not of the man I had become, but of the man I once was. That flicker became a spark, and that spark became a quiet storm rising within me. I turned off the television and sat in the dim light of the room, the glow of the screen fading, but the fire inside me growing. For the first time in years, I felt something other than regret. I felt the stirrings of defiance, and with it came a new thought, sharp and clear. If my own family would not see me, then I would make myself visible to the world. The next morning, I woke with a strange energy. It was not the kind of vigor I had when I was young, but it was sharper than the sluggishness that had weighed me down in recent years. I brewed a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the pale sun crawl across the buildings. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like the day was something to endure. I felt like it was something to claim. I picked up the phone and searched for Frank's name, wondering if the number I had from decades ago would still connect. My hand trembled as I pressed the digits, but when his voice came through, steady and warm, it was as if no time had passed at all. "Thomas? I'll be damned. It's been years," he said, and I could almost hear the smile in his tone. I told him about the surgery, the recovery, and most importantly, the way I had been left to navigate it alone. He listened without judgment, without pity, just the way a brother-in-arms should. When I hesitated, unsure if I should ask, he filled the silence for me. "Why don't you come down and see what we're doing here? We could use another set of hands." That invitation was the first door that had opened for me in years. A week later, I stood in a park where volunteers hammered, painted, and cleaned. The air buzzed with activity, laughter, and the rhythmic sound of work. My chest ached from the lingering weakness of surgery, but the ache was nothing compared to the rush of belonging that swept over me. I picked up a piece of sandpaper and began smoothing the rough edges of a bench, and for the first time since Margaret's death, I felt useful again. The other volunteers welcomed me with nods and smiles, not asking for explanations, not treating me like a fragile relic. They treated me as one of them. As the hours passed, sweat mixed with dust, and my muscles complained, but my spirit soared. Each stroke of sandpaper, each nail hammered into wood, was a reminder that I was not finished, not invisible, not erased. I still had strength to give. That afternoon, a news crew arrived. They set up cameras, interviewed Frank, and captured footage of the work being done. I thought little of it at first, but when the reporter turned to me with her microphone and asked what the day meant to me, the words rose from somewhere deep inside, unplanned yet true. "Home is where you return," I said, my voice steady, "and where someone is waiting to open the gate." Those words came from my soul, from years of longing and hurt, from the memory of Margaret at the door, from the absence of Michael and Sarah. The reporter nodded thoughtfully, and the cameraman captured my face, my hands still covered in sawdust. I did not realize how far those words would travel. That evening, as I sat again in my apartment, I watched myself on television. The segment showed me sanding the bench, smiling faintly as I worked, then speaking those words. The anchor repeated them with admiration, and for a moment, I felt like the man I once had been, the man my daughter still believed me to be. But I was not the only one watching. Across town, Michael and Sarah saw the same broadcast. I did not need to imagine their reactions, because my phone lit up almost immediately. Call after call, message after message, their names flashing across the screen. They were not reaching out of love or guilt. They were afraid. Afraid their friends, neighbors, and colleagues would see what they had tried to keep hidden, that they had abandoned me, that they had erased me from their family. I let the phone ring. I let the messages pile up. For the first time, I held the power to decide if and when I would answer. And with each unanswered call, a weight lifted from me. The man they had dismissed as weak, frail, and expendable was now on their television screens, his words echoing across the city. The next morning, I gathered documents from a drawer that had sat untouched for years. Property records, old deeds, and financial papers lay scattered across my kitchen table. As I sifted through them, I uncovered something that tightened my jaw. Signatures that did not match. Letters addressed to a post office box I had never known existed. Details that hinted at deception. Sarah's hand was all over it. She had been weaving threads behind my back, tying knots in ways I had been too blind, too trusting, too silent to see. I realized that my erasure had not been accidental. It had been designed. Piece by piece, she had carved me out of the story, painting me as a burden, while quietly securing her own comfort. That discovery did not break me, it steeled me. For years, silence had been my prison. But now, silence had become my weapon. My calm frightened them more than any outburst could. As I stacked the papers neatly, preparing for the battles ahead, I felt something I had not felt in decades. I felt ready not just to survive, but to stand, to reclaim my worth, and to remind them all that I was still here, still strong, still their father. The morning after I uncovered those documents, I sat at the kitchen table with papers spread before me like pieces of a puzzle. The weak sunlight crept across the table, touching the edges of deeds, receipts, and letters that told a story I had been too blind to read. For years I had convinced myself that silence was the best way to keep peace, but now the evidence of betrayal lay in front of me, undeniable and sharp. I saw Sarah's signature where it did not belong, lines written in a hand that was not mine, a post office box I had never used, a pattern of decisions designed to edge me out. The betrayal was not just emotional, it was practical, calculated, and thorough. At first, the weight of it pressed on me, and I felt the familiar ache of defeat creeping in, the voice that told me I was too old, too tired, too small to fight back. But then I remembered Frank's voice on the phone, the laughter of the volunteers, the reporter's camera capturing my words, and the calls from Michael and Sarah that I had ignored. They were afraid of my calm, and I realized then that fear could work both ways. I began to sort the documents carefully, creating neat stacks as if order itself could give me strength. With each paper I placed aside, my mind sharpened. This was not just about betrayal anymore, it was about reclaiming my dignity. For too long I had let others dictate the shape of my life, from the Navy drills that demanded obedience, to the managers who expected silence, to my own family, who had grown comfortable with taking and never giving. It was time I wrote my own lines. Later that day, I picked up the phone and called Frank again. He answered with the same steady voice, and when I told him what I had discovered, he paused before saying, "You always were the quiet one, Thomas. But sometimes quiet men roar the loudest when the time comes." His words sank deep into me. He invited me to another project, this time at a community center, where veterans were rebuilding classrooms for after-school programs. I agreed, not just to help but to remind myself that I was still capable of showing up. When I arrived, the building smelled of sawdust and fresh paint. Men and women, some younger, some older, moved with purpose. I picked up a hammer, felt its weight in my hand, and for a moment I was transported back to the days when my strength was unquestioned. My arms ached, my heart raced faster than it should, but I kept at it, driven not by pride but by necessity. Every nail I drove into wood was a declaration. I am still here. I am not gone. I am not erased. The local news crew returned, drawn to the sight of veterans giving back. This time, I did not shy away. I let them film me, let them ask questions. And when they pressed me again for my thoughts, I said, "We are never too old to build. A home, a community, a life. It is never too late to create something worth keeping." My words echoed through the hall, and though I spoke them to the reporter, I knew they were meant for Michael and Sarah as much as anyone. That night, my phone buzzed again with their names. Dozens of missed calls, messages that shifted from casual greetings to pleading explanations. They wrote things like, "Dad, we were just joking. You know we care." And Sarah didn't mean what she said. She was under stress. The words rang hollow, flimsy covers for the truth. They were not reaching out from love. They were reaching out from fear, afraid that the world would see what they had hidden for so long. And still, I let the phone remain silent. For the first time, my silence was not surrender. It was strength. In the days that followed, I found myself walking taller, breathing deeper, carrying myself with a pride I thought had been buried with Margaret. I remembered her words from long ago, the way she once told me, "You are steady, Thomas, and steady men change the world, not by noise but by presence." For years I had misunderstood her, thinking steady meant invisible. Now I saw that steady meant resilient, unshakable, a force that endures when everything else crumbles. Emily called during one of her short breaks. She had seen the news segment online, and her voice carried warmth so bright I felt it through the line. "Dad, I saw you on television. I'm so proud of you," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I closed my eyes and let her words sink in. In that moment, all the pain of Michael's rejection softened. I did not need the validation of those who had turned away when I had the love of the one who had never forgotten me. But still, the documents on my table remained, and with them the knowledge that Sarah's deception had crossed from emotional cruelty into legal fraud. The thought of confronting them filled me with both dread and determination. I knew that if I remained silent, they would continue to take. But if I spoke, if I acted, I would finally force them to face the truth. It was not about revenge, it was about respect, about making clear that I was not a man to be erased. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the light cast long shadows across my apartment, I made a quiet vow. I would no longer wait for Michael to return to me, for Sarah to soften, for apologies that would never come. I would chart my own course, just as I had once done at sea when storms threatened to pull me under. The tide had turned, and I was ready to rise with it. The weeks that followed felt like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. Each day I woke with the awareness that change was moving closer, that the fragile balance of silence and avoidance was about to shatter. The documents on my table became both a burden and a weapon. They whispered to me each morning, reminding me that Sarah's hand had left trails of deception, that Michael had either looked away or chosen blindness. I could not unsee what I had seen, nor could I ignore the weight of it any longer. Frank kept me busy with the veterans' projects. I threw myself into the work, sanding, painting, carrying, even though my body ached and my heart reminded me daily that it had been stitched not long ago. Sweat dripped into my eyes, muscles throbbed, but there was a strange sweetness in the exhaustion. At the end of each day I looked around and saw playgrounds restored, benches repaired, and walls brightened with fresh paint. The laughter of children returned to those places, echoing through the air, and I felt as though Margaret herself was smiling at me from somewhere unseen. The news crews came more often. They began to recognize me, not just as a volunteer, but as a voice worth hearing. One evening, a reporter asked me to share my thoughts again. I stood before the camera, dust on my clothes, the smell of wood still in my hands, and I said, "A man is not measured by what he keeps, but by what he gives. When we build something that outlives us, we find our true worth." The words were simple, but they carried weight because they were born of pain and survival. That night, I saw myself again on television, and once more the phone lit up with Michael's name. I let it ring. Eventually, the calls shifted in tone. The early ones had been casual, filled with excuses. Later, they grew more urgent, with words like, "We need to talk, Dad, and please call us back." I knew it was not concern. It was fear. Their friends and neighbors must have seen me on the news, must have asked questions about why their father was volunteering with strangers instead of being cared for by family. I imagined Sarah's smile cracking as whispers spread, her carefully crafted image threatened by a truth she could not control. It was during one of those evenings, while the phone buzzed without answer, that I decided I would no longer hide. I gathered the documents into a folder, placed it beside me, and stared at it until the weight of decision felt solid in my chest. I was not out for revenge. I was out for recognition, for the restoration of respect that had been denied to me. For too long, I had been the quiet man in the corner, the one whose sacrifices were invisible. That time was finished. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Frank invited me to a larger event, one that would draw city officials and local leaders. The veterans were unveiling the finished park, and the mayor himself was scheduled to attend. Cameras would be everywhere, and the community would gather. As I stood among the volunteers that day, the air crisp and alive with chatter, I felt the significance of the moment. When the ribbon was cut and the cameras turned to capture faces, mine was among them. The reporter who had spoken with me before sought me out again. She asked me what this park meant to me personally, and I felt the words rise unbidden, shaped by years of longing. "Home is not walls or roofs," I said softly. It is the place where you are seen, where your absence matters. Every man deserves a home, and sometimes when it is taken from you, you have to build another with your own hands. The crowd applauded, and for a brief moment I stood taller than I had in years. That evening, the story aired on every local channel. My words spread further than I had ever imagined. The phone calls from Michael and Sarah doubled, then tripled. I did not answer. Instead, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and let the storm rage outside. They were afraid, not of my anger, but of my calm. They had built their comfort on the belief that I would remain silent, and now silence had turned against them. I knew the time was coming when I would confront them, not in anger but in truth. The folder on my table waited, heavy with proof of betrayal. My voice, once hidden, was now echoing in homes across the city. And for the first time in decades, I felt prepared to face whatever came next. The night after the park unveiling, I barely slept. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, my mind crowded with thoughts of what was coming. The phone buzzed again and again on the nightstand, lighting up with Michael's name, with Sarah's, with messages I refused to open. I imagined their faces, tense and pale, scrambling for explanations to give neighbors who had seen the news. It struck me then that for years I had been the one lying awake, carrying the weight of silence, while they slept soundly in the home I had sacrificed for. Now the roles had reversed. Their comfort was breaking, and my calm was the force undoing it. By morning, I had made my decision. I dressed slowly, folded the folder of documents under my arm, and walked out of the apartment with the steadiness of a man who finally knew his destination. The cab ride to Michael's house was quiet, except for the hum of traffic. I watched the streets roll past, each block carrying me closer to the place that had once been mine. When we pulled up to the house, my chest tightened. The yard I had mowed for decades, the porch Margaret had decorated every autumn, the windows I had cleaned with my own hands, all of it was now theirs, yet it still carried my fingerprints in every corner. I rang the bell, and when the door opened, Sarah stood there, her smile forced, her eyes wide with unease. "Thomas, we were just about to call you again," she said quickly, her voice higher than usual. Michael appeared behind her, his face stiff, caught between guilt and defensiveness. I stepped inside, without waiting for an invitation. The air was thick, the silence heavy. I placed the folder on the table and sat down in the chair I had once claimed as my own during countless family dinners. "I know what you did," I said quietly, opening the folder. Page by page, I spread the evidence across the table. Deeds, signatures, receipts, each one a stone laid bare. Sarah's face paled. Michael shifted uncomfortably, but neither spoke. The room was filled with the sound of paper sliding, proof building its own voice. I looked at them, not with rage, but with steady certainty. "You tried to erase me, not just from this house, but from my own family. You thought I would stay silent, but silence is no longer my choice." Michael finally spoke, his voice low and shaky. "Dad, you don't understand. We were just—" I cut him off with a raised hand. "No, Michael, for years I gave and you took. I stayed quiet because I thought that was love. But love does not erase. Love does not abandon a man fresh out of surgery. Love does not sell him off as if he were furniture too heavy to carry." His eyes dropped to the floor, and Sarah pressed her lips together, anger flickering beneath her fear. I gathered the papers back into the folder, leaving just one photograph on the table, Emily's card, with the lion she had drawn years ago. "This is what love looks like," I said, tapping the photo with my finger. "Simple, constant, without condition." Then I stood, my knees stiff, but my spine straight. "You may try to cover what you have done. You may try to explain it away, but the truth has already been spoken. The world has seen me, and you cannot erase that." I left the house without another word. The autumn air felt crisp and clean on my face, as if I had walked out not just of their home, but of the cage I had lived in for years. The cab driver glanced at me in the mirror and asked, "You all right, sir?" I nodded slowly. "Better than I've been in a long time." That evening, I returned to the community center where the veterans were gathering. Frank clasped my shoulder with a knowing smile, and the others welcomed me as if I had always belonged. We shared stories, laughter, and plans for the next project. For the first time in years, I was not simply surviving, I was living. And though Michael and Sarah continued to call, their voices now desperate with fear of exposure, I no longer felt bound to them. I had reclaimed something greater than their approval. I had reclaimed myself. As I lay in bed that night, my body weary from the day's work, but my spirit lighter than ever, I whispered to myself, "Home is not where they accept you. Home is where you stand tall." And with that, I closed my eyes and drifted into the first peaceful sleep I had known in years. Years my life had been defined by waiting, waiting for a call that never came, waiting for respect that was never given, waiting for love that had long since dried up. Now, for the first time in decades, I no longer felt the weight of waiting. I had spoken my truth, and I had walked away without begging for their forgiveness or their attention. That act alone gave me a freedom I had not known I was missing. I rose each morning with a steadier breath, poured my coffee, and looked out the window not with despair but with a quiet strength. The phone still rang. Michael and Sarah continued to call, their messages growing longer, filled with apologies that rang hollow. They wrote things like, "Dad, we made mistakes, we want to make it right," or "Please talk to us. The neighbors keep asking questions." The words revealed more fear than love, more desperation to protect their reputation than a genuine desire to heal. For a time, I ignored them entirely, letting their pleas fade into the background. Silence had once been my prison, but now it was my shield. I no longer needed to chase after what was not freely given. Instead, I poured myself into the work with Frank and the veterans. Each project we took on stitched me back together in ways the surgeons never could. My hands grew calloused again, my back sore, yet the pain was sweet because it came from purpose. We built benches for playgrounds, repainted classrooms, repaired fences for families who could not afford the cost. Children began to recognize me, waving as they passed the park we had restored. Their voices were like music, filling the air with the kind of innocence that reminded me of Michael and Emily when they were small. I felt my heart swell not with bitterness, but with gratitude. One afternoon, Emily called during her lunch break. She had seen another news segment featuring me and the veterans, and her voice carried a warmth that wrapped around me like sunlight. "Dad, you look so strong on television," she said. I wish I could have been there. I told her that she was with me in spirit, that every word I spoke carried her encouragement. She laughed softly, and for a moment it was as if Margaret herself was in the room, her gentle presence woven through Emily's laughter. That call reminded me that love, even when scarce, can be enough if it is genuine. I began to notice small changes in myself. The lines on my face did not disappear, the grey in my hair did not fade, but my posture grew taller, my steps firmer. When I walked into the community centre or the park, I was no longer the man who lingered at the edges. I was the man who belonged, who contributed, who mattered. People shook my hand, clapped my back, asked for my advice. They saw me, and being seen after years of invisibility was a gift beyond measure. Still, the tension with Michael and Sarah lingered in the background like a storm that refused to pass. One evening, I finally picked up the phone, not out of weakness, but out of curiosity. Michael's voice trembled as he spoke, trying to weave apologies into excuses. "Dad, we didn't mean to hurt you. Sarah was stressed. I was busy with work. We should have been there for you." His words spilled out quickly, as if speed could erase the years of neglect. I listened in silence until he faltered, then said calmly, "Michael, excuses are for accidents. What you did was a choice, and choices carry consequences." There was a long pause before he whispered, "Can we fix this?" I closed my eyes and answered truthfully, "That depends on you, not on me. Respect cannot be borrowed like money. It has to be given freely." Then I ended the call, leaving the words to echo in his ears. From that moment, I stopped expecting reconciliation. If it came, it would come not from my effort, but from their own reckoning. I no longer needed their approval to feel whole. I had found my place among people who valued me, who looked at me and saw not a burden, but a man with something left to give. As weeks turned into months, the projects continued. We planted trees in the park, their roots digging deep into the soil, a promise of shade for future generations. Watching them grow reminded me that my life, too, still had roots. I had not been uprooted as Sarah once hoped. I was planting myself anew in ground that welcomed me. The laughter of children running through the playground was proof that our labor mattered. I often sat on one of the benches I had sanded, letting the sound wash over me, and thought that perhaps this was what home truly meant, not walls or deeds or ownership, but belonging. Emily visited me once when her schedule allowed. She arrived tired from her long shifts, but her eyes shone with pride. She walked with me through the park, pointing at the painted walls and newly planted trees, and said, "Dad, this is beautiful. You helped make this happen." I felt tears sting my eyes, and I whispered, "Your mother would have loved this." Emily squeezed my hand and nodded. In that moment, I realized that even if Michael never came back, even if Sarah never apologized, I had enough. The community began to recognize me more often. At the grocery store, people would stop and thank me for the work at the park. At the diner, strangers would nod in recognition, calling me the man from the news. I had never sought fame, but the acknowledgement warmed me. After years of being dismissed in my own family, being valued by strangers reminded me that worth does not vanish because a few refuse to see it. As for Michael and Sarah, their calls eventually slowed. Perhaps they grew weary of my silence, or perhaps they realized that their words could not undo what had been done. Either way, I felt no anger, only acceptance. Their choices had shaped them, just as mine had shaped me. I could not force them to love, and I no longer wished to beg for what should have been given freely. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings and the park glowed with the laughter of children, I sat quietly on a bench and let my thoughts wander. I thought of Margaret, of how she would have scolded me gently for staying silent so long. I thought of Emily, her strength carrying me through even when miles separated us. I thought of Michael, not with bitterness, but with a faint sadness, hoping one day he might remember the boy who once shouted, "Daddy's home," with joy. And finally, I thought of myself not as a victim, not as a burden, but as a man who had endured, who had risen, who had reclaimed his worth. That realization was the true resolution of my story. It was not about punishing those who wronged me or forcing apologies from unwilling lips. It was about seeing myself again, about standing tall in the face of rejection and choosing to live fully anyway. I had once believed my life had ended in that hospital room, abandoned by the people I loved most. But in truth, my life began again, the moment I decided that silence would no longer define me. If there is one truth I have learned from this journey, it is that the deepest wounds are not carved by scalpels or accidents, but by the hands of those we once believed would never let us fall. My heart was repaired by surgeons, but it was broken by silence, neglect, and betrayal from my own blood. Yet out of that pain, I discovered something I had forgotten. A man's worth is not measured by how his family treats him, but by how he chooses to rise when the world turns its back. To anyone listening, I say this: never let someone else decide your value, whether it is a son too busy to care, a daughter-in-law who pushes you aside, or even your own fear whispering that your best years are behind you. None of these voices have the right to define you. You are defined by what you give, by the love you continue to show, and by the courage to keep standing when life tries to push you down. I once thought my silence was strength, but I see now that true strength is speaking when your voice shakes, standing when your legs are weak, and refusing to be erased. Family may fail you, friends may drift away, but if you keep showing up for life, life will show up for you. I found that in the laughter of children playing in the park we rebuilt, in the warm calls from my daughter Emily, in the handshake of a stranger who simply said, "Thank you." Those moments reminded me that purpose does not retire with age, and dignity does not fade with grey hair. So to every father, every mother, every soul who feels invisible, do not give up. Your story is not finished until you decide to stop writing it. Build something, even if it is small. Give love, even when it feels scarce. Speak truth, even if it shakes the world around you. And if my story touched your heart today, I ask one simple thing. Stay with me. Subscribe, share, and join this journey, because there are countless voices like mine waiting to be heard. Together, we can remind the world that no one is ever too old, too broken, or too forgotten to rise again.